our West Indian possessions, which the United States upon the mainland did not even dare to face for another quarter of a century, and then decided only after 4 years of civil war. Yet while so much was being done for these black slaves overseas, little was and still less said about the white industrial drudges here at home. The Whigs, whatever their virtues, were more theorists and philosophers than true philanthropists. Their heads were so full of lofty sentiments about the rights of man that they could spare no thought for the women and young children who were toiling for intolerable hours, by night as well as day, in the mines and cotton mills of Lancashire. Scandals and abuses then went on, of which the bare recountal would now shock us beyond words, but which in those days were regarded as a mere matter of due course. Who were no more callous than the rest of their contemporaries, simply thought in terms of politics and not in terms of life. When starving men were asking them for bread, they talked big about the boat, and after a brief period of encouragement, men's hopes of Whig idealism died down again. The Reform Bill had done nothing for their miseries. Instead of a governing class of landed gentlemen, it had given them a governing class of manufacturers and landed gentlemen combined. That was all. And in the moment of their bitter disillusionment, the last, perhaps almost worse than the first.
Attention. 5 minutes left in the mission.
Chapter 5.
5 minutes left in the mission.
The workers organize. This is certainly the happiest country in the world, said some sarcastic person at the time of the Whigs' fall. Nobody wants anything. And there was a grim truth behind the saying. Nobody appeared to want anything, for the very simple reason that nobody could afford it. There was no demand for labor because industry was slack. Industry was slack because there was no demand for goods. And once again, there was no demand for goods because when men are out of work, they get no wage. Caught in that vicious circle of stagnation, the country went straight for ruin. Things went from... The year 1842 was a record year for pauperism and crime. This after a decade of Whig administration. And already the people had begun to realize that neither party in the House of Commons was likely to do anything for them. There was nothing for it, therefore, but to do something for themselves. Yet there were immense obstacles across their path. And of these, the worst, beyond a doubt, was lack of education. The mass of laboring class were quite unlettered. They had little opportunity to learn. There was no national system of elementary schools, no law compelling children to attend what schools there were. So millions of men could neither read nor write, and for such to organize effectively was well nigh impossible. Whatever efforts were made in that direction were therefore half crippled at the start by black ignorance, folly, which usually attended. Nevertheless, there were not wanting leaders if the mass would follow. There were men, middle-class enthusiasts for the most part, but sometimes even of the working class itself, who had been roused to thought by the miseries around them, and who, since the beginning of the century, had stood out as preachers of revolutionary gospels or as spokesmen of the popular demands. The great national upheaval which had occurred in neighboring France had exercised a profound influence upon such thinkers. Some had studied the treatises of Rousseau and preached in their turn the doctrine of liberty, equality, and the brotherhood of man. Among these, Tom Paine, the tobacconist philosopher, was perhaps the most notorious. The publication of his book, The Rights of Man, had filled the authorities with wild alarm. The book had been laid under a ban. Men were actually transported for the crime of selling it, and Paine himself was forced to flee the country. He went to Paris and served in the convention under Robespierre, fell into disfavor and was put into prison. Finally, in 1802, left France for North America, where he subsequently died, a victim, so his enemies declared, to the kindred vices of atheism and drink. Yet Paine's example fired other rebel spirits. Pamphlets were written to spread their dangerous views, and despite the vigilance of the police, were circulated widely. Wild schemes were spun for wholesale socialist reform, the abolition of all private property, and the leveling of all classes to an equal plane. Secret societies were formed in towns where men read revolutionary essays and vowed with to take vengeance for their wrongs. A few more practically minded than the rest attempted to make some small beginnings of reform by experiments of their own. One such was Robert Owen, the famous philanthropist of Lanark on the Clyde. He had risen from the humble post of a draper's shop assistant to be manager and part owner of a mill. The opportunity was thus afforded him of putting his ideals into practice. He made a careful study of the life of the mill hands and attempted in whatever way he could to render it more human. He cut down the hours of work to reasonable limits, established a school for the use of his employees, and set up a shop where they could purchase goods on the cooperative plan. Owen has good claim to be regarded as the founder of the cooperative store. The purpose of the system, which has since had a great vogue, about the services of the middleman retailer, and so save his gains for the pockets of the poor. The plan of a cooperative society is to run a shop for the use of its own members, and then at the end of the year to divide up the profits of the sales among them. Since Owens's day, the movement has grown enormously. Until now, a large proportion of the retail business of the country is in the hands of cooperative stores. The experiment was an